Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Shanell Thomas, and I am a candidate for the PhD in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Howard University. I'm very excited to be here today with these esteemed gentlemen discussing the enfranchisement of returning citizens. So by way of introduction, I'm going to go ahead, in terms of the flow of our session today, I'm going to go ahead and introduce all of the gentlemen who will be part of the panel today. And then Dr. Perry will start us off in terms of our conversation, followed by Dr. Andrisse, and then rounding out our conversation will be Dr. Carruth. And so let me just give a little bit of background for each of the people who will be with us today. I'm going to be reading. So. Okay, so Dr. Perry joined the Department of Political Science at Howard University in 2019 as the chair and as the professor. Previously, he was the chair of the Political Science Department at Virginia Commonwealth University and was a member of the faculty at Mississippi State University and Clark University. He's an expert on Black politics, minority representation, urban politics, American public policies, and LGBT candidates of color. He's also the editor of 21st Century Urban Race Politics, representing minorities as universal interests, a book that discusses the efforts of African American, Latino, and Asian mayors to represent the interests of minorities in historically white cities in the United States. His second book, entitled Black Mayors and White Majorities, The Balancing Act of Racial Politics, focuses on the challenges Black mayors face in representing Black interests in majority white, medium-sized cities in the state of Ohio. His third book, which he published with his mother, is called The Little Rock Crisis: What Desegregation Politics Says About Us. Okay. Then we have Dr. Stanley Andrisse, and he is a formerly incarcerated person with 3 felony convictions, sentenced to 10 years in prison. And what's specific about his story is that he was once told by a prosecuting attorney that he had no hope for change. And he is now an endocrinology scientist and alumni faculty of Johns Hopkins Medicine and assistant professor at Howard College of Medicine. Dr. Andrisse is also an executive director of From Prison Cells to PhD, an organization dedicated to promoting and advocating for higher education for currently and formerly incarcerated men and women. And then finally, we have Dr. Carruth, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Strategic, Legal, and Management Communication of the Kathy Hughes Schools of Communications. Prior to coming back to Howard, Dr. Carruth concluded a 3-year fellowship in the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He utilizes interdisciplinary approaches to cultivate effective communication strategies through theory and practice, and specifically does this by incorporating diverse and interdependent traditional, social, digital, and emerging technologies. And so with that said, now that we've kind of given you a sense of who is speaking with us today, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Perry, who is going to start us off.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be with you for what is a sobering, but such an important and critically valuable topic now, as we have, of course, embarked on yet another presidential election year where already over 11 million people have cast ballots in an election that is on pace to have been the most highest participating election of African Americans, at least since the Obama years, but perhaps even beyond that based on some of the polls. We will see how that pans out. And this discussion on the right of returning citizens to be able to fully participate in American democracy is a discussion that we really should be having every day, because every single day there are hundreds of thousands of people throughout the country that do not have that right, that many of us take for granted and don't even exercise. And so I think it's really important for us to start by running through some of the numbers. And so I want to invite everyone, if you are unaware, to certainly visit the Sentencing Project, which is a nonprofit organization that provides a lot of public data on felony disenfranchisement. I think that you will find a lot of resources there regardless of what your opinions may be on this issue, that will better inform you on where we are as a country right now in 2020 on these issues. To throw out some of these numbers right now that I think is important right now, we've got 5.2 million Americans who are not in a position to vote because that right has been taken away from them. And so that's 5.2 million. 1 out of every 16 African Americans, 1 out of every 59 everybody else. So you can figure out the math there. I'm not a math whiz, but you can figure out, right, that of course, if you are Black, you are far more likely to have your right to vote taken away from you simply because of a conviction. For women, to emphasize, because we often overemphasize the role of men, and if Orange is the New Black and other shows hasn't reminded you that women, of course, play a huge role in everyday society, but also, unfortunately, in both the running and in the living in some prisons and jails around the country. What we know there is that there's roughly about 250,000 Black women who also have their rights disenfranchised at the moment, right now, today. And by what do we mean by this? What we mean by is that you are given a right to vote because, right, of the protest activity of hundreds of years, of course, but certainly most poignantly here in the United States in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where we decided that it was finally time to galvanize together and to demand that right to vote. And that right to vote, of course, was a product of a long-standing effort in American politics, where it was first granted, of course, in 1870 to a select group of Black men during Reconstruction. That lasted about 6 or 7 years until the 1876 election, where there was a tie. And the agreement was that if the Ohioan Rutherford B. Hayes took the presidency, that he would remove the federal troops from the South. That began what we call today voter suppression, arguably. And that led to the process, of course, many Black folks being elected to office in the 1800s, losing those positions forthwith. And the Black representation that we saw during Reconstruction simply going away. I want to emphasize those were only men, but that was the first instance we've got in 1870. I go back that far because, of course, as we may recall from Ava DuVernay's 13th Netflix documentary, we remember that the 13th Amendment says that slavery, is abolished except in the punishment of a crime. And we know that many have argued, whether, of course, it be scholars like Michelle Alexander, and so many others that have said that today's criminal justice system, today's mass incarceration that we see at the hands of the state is really just a holdover from the 13th Amendment. And what that also says is that that amendment is still there. It still says this, it still stands. And the only way that those types of amendments change is if voters participate in local and state elections. And that's my next point that I wanted to mention. The way in which most people who have their rights taken away from them because of a conviction have any chance of getting those rights restored is through the office of the governor in most instances. In some cases, it has occurred in legal situations and courts, in other cases in legislative arenas, like in Florida and some other places, but it varies. In most cases in the United States, it's often occurred either directly because of executive order by a governor, or certainly the governor using their bully pulpit to move the legislature in a particular direction, or the state Supreme Court in some instances as well. And that reminds us, hopefully all of us, that we have to participate in local and state elections. And so if we care about criminal justice in Black communities, if we care about fair sentencing, then we have to care about the local district attorney. We have to care about who our local elected officials are. We have to know who the governor, lieutenant governors are, who your local attorneys are that handle public defense cases and what have you, because it's mostly African Americans that we're talking about, and it's also mostly African Americans that are disproportionately not participating as much as we are eligible to in local elections. And the reasons for that we know, and I will end with this. The reasons for that we know are because we've been so disenfranchised and we've been so structurally kept out of the system that it makes it seem difficult for so many of us to be able to go to that same system and petition it for redress of wrongs when that system first said that we were 3/5 of a human being, when that system, of course, made us indentured servants and then shadow slaves as a result of the condition that was forced upon us. And then, of course, yes, those who have been engaged with the criminal justice system. And as a Black gay man who lives with HIV, I wanted to add the intersectionality as well of folks who get convicted, including felony convictions of HIV criminalization, and what we do or rather don't do as it relates to the changing of the law. And the current moment that I know we'll talk about later with the Supreme Court case on the docket now has everything to do with this issue, because where this court will go, and let's be clear, it's pretty clear where it's going to go. So the real question needs to be, what are we going to do? But where this court allegedly is going to go says that we have already, in many ways, lost this battle. I hate being a pessimist, particularly on a glorious Friday, but the reality is this administration has already appointed over 300 federal lifetime judges, most of them who are in their 40s, most of them who have poor ratings from the American Bar Association on basic things like competence and legal skill. And so what I'm really encouraging, hopefully, is that people not only take stock of the vehement kind of disregard that institutions in America have had toward the criminalization of Black people and Black women in particular, and Black folks of other intersectional identities in the criminal justice system, and the huge erasure of their participation as a result in politics. That's a story that needs to be told. The other story that I'd love for us to talk about later is also, how do we solve this problem when we've already are so far deep with 300 plus federal judges that are going to be there for the rest of our lifetime? And so with the generation we've got, you know, how can we actually solve this felony disenfranchisement issue? I think the answer ultimately is going to have to result in Congress raising their voices and raising their power. But that, of course, will depend on those of us who vote on November 3rd.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Perry. Definitely appreciate that. You brought up some good points for us to kind of ruminate on. I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Andrisse and have him share some of his wisdom and knowledge with us at this point.
All right. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining in. And thanks for the individuals who organized this particular session and invited me. I encourage you all to visit my website and learn more about our program, Prison to Professionals, that helps formerly incarcerated men and women obtain higher education. I'll be posting that in the chat for folks to take a look at. So I wanted to start out by additionally framing what has already been framed for us by my colleague. So in this nation we live in, we incarcerate more people than any other country in the entire world. And I'm sure that's not news to this audience. 2.2 million of our fellow Americans are currently locked in cages. The US accounts for only 5% of the world population, but 25% of the incarcerated population around the globe is right here in America. 1/4 of people locked in cages around the globe is right here in this great nation of America. An estimated 70 to 90 million Americans, 1/3 of the working age Americans, have some form of criminal legal involvement. And what does that mean? It means people like me and others potentially on this call sitting here in front of you in chains. So as was mentioned, my name is Stanley Andrisse. I'm a formerly incarcerated person with 3 felony convictions, sentenced to 10 years in prison as a prior and persistent career criminal who was once told by a prosecuting attorney that I had no hope. No hope. And I'm now sitting here in front of you as Dr. Professor Stanley Andrisse, an endocrinologist scientist, a former professor at Johns Hopkins Medicine, a visiting professor at Georgetown Medicine, and of course, a tenure track assistant professor here at the Mecca. I'd say I probably changed this a little bit from what this prosecutor was prophesizing those many years ago. But I'm still in front of you in chains in many ways. When I was finally released from prison, it was one of the joyous days of my life. But I really wasn't free. I was still shackled in many, many ways. I could walk, but I couldn't run. So I used education to literally break those chains. But even still, I have the remnants of incarceration. I still have the collateral consequences of incarceration. In society's eyes, by many, by what most people conventionally use about a person like myself, I'm still a convict, a felon, a career criminal, a lifetime lowlife, a second-class citizen. I still have the mark on me, this scarlet letter, this bracelet of damnation that many people use to refer to people like me. Although I am free, I am still in chains. I want to take you back to, to tell you a little bit about the historic Obama election. So I once waited at the polls for 3 long hours while a nice old lady called every public official in the state of Missouri to try and help this excited young man vote in the Obama 2012 election. 20 plus calls later, an answer came direct from the governor's office. This nice old white lady who was pushing 90 years easily pulled me to the side and whispered to me, "They say you're a criminal." I was like, "What?" I looked at her with disbelief, and to my surprise, she gave me the same look of disbelief. "You're not committing any crimes right now. They should just let you vote." This rejection brought me back to my prison cell. Although I am free, I am still in chains. I'm trusted to make scientific contributions that advance the well-being of society, but that same society doesn't want me to vote. I was brought back to this euphoric agony of the 2008 Obama-McCain election. I was locked in a cage at a maximum security prison, 22-hour lockdown, only 2 hours free, half hour for breakfast, half hour for lunch, half hour for dinner, half hour for rec time. We were witnessing the election of the first Black US president. And in prison, we had, these designated lights out time. But on this particular night, the guards made this exception and they left the TV on all night so we could follow the election. If I could paint you a picture of this particular environment, a typical prison housing unit has 1 guard monitoring station in the middle, 4 wings off of that monitoring station, roughly 2 people per cell, so roughly 400 people inside of cells. But as a result of mass incarceration, an additional 50 bunk beds were placed outside of cells. And so in this space, no bigger than, a grade school gym, there's 800 people locked up. And about 90% of them were Black. I mean, I can never forget how loud it was. People were banging on doors in excitement. And we were singing, I'm sure most of you, as my HU community, I'm sure most of you will remember the Young Jeezy song, "My president is Black, my Lambo is blue, and I'll be, if my rims ain't too." I mean, we were singing this in unison like we were a church choir. 900, so, close to 900 individuals. We were hugging and high-fiving. You don't see this type of stuff in prison, but we were hopeful for change. It was this euphoric experience that is burned into my memory. But in the back of my mind, the agony of thinking that I actually would never be a part of this experience. I'm not actually able to vote. I am not actually a citizen in the eyes of our society. In the eyes of our society, I'm a criminal. This was this extremely painful moment that came after this extremely euphoric moment. My home state of Missouri doesn't allow people convicted of crime to vote for a very, very long time. For nearly 17 years, they took away my constitutional right as a U.S. citizen to vote for the people who will run our country. I still can't vote in Missouri. They still don't consider me a citizen. I'm still not reformed enough for them. Why? Because of felony disenfranchisement. In Florida, people with convictions can never vote until recently just changed, but that's actually looking to be changed again. At one point in time, the Black population in Florida, 25% could not vote. And it was estimated that if policies didn't change, that nearly 40% couldn't vote. That's nearly half of this Black population in Florida that they're trying to take away the vote from, that they have successfully done that for a long time. The 2000 elections was impacted by felony disenfranchisement. Recently, in the last election in the state of Maryland, I walked into the voting poll location with the sense of happiness and pride, while others were complaining about the long lines and being impatient. I walked in there with this great sense of patience. Inside of my head, I was dancing around like a little kid, waiting for a Christmas present. The euphoria was not excitement about the presidential election, which was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, and we know the results of that particular election. But I had this sense of joy because I was about to vote. For the very first time in a very, very long time. This is serious. This is an attack against Black people. And we have to take this serious. We have to. And for a place like HU, we have to be part of this conversation. We have to be leading this conversation. When I tell my non-criminal justice-minded friends about how I couldn't vote for all those years, they're appalled. Most have no idea about this thing called collateral consequences or felony disenfranchisement. We have to do more.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrisse, for sharing your experiences and the pain and the pride that's come out of this for you, right, and what you've been able to accomplish. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carruth and ask him to lead us in the final segment of our speakers.
Oh, thank you again for having me. Thanks, Dr. Perry and Dr. Andrisse for their comments, and it leads me to kind of almost think about how I want to restructure what I'm going to say. But I want to actually, if I'm allowed to, share my screen and just show us a few things. Coming from the School of Communications, I'm a visual learner, visual teacher, and I think those elements will kind of put everything together, and we can have an ongoing conversation after this. So if you can bear with me, I'll pull my screen up, and if you can let me know if it's okay. If we're good, I'll go back to my beginning here. Again, thank you for having me. Roger Carruth, I'm an assistant professor in the Caste School of Communication and the Department of Legal, Strategic and Management Communications. So again, this has been very enlightening, and I'm charged to be here because I grew up, family of Caribbean immigrants. I came to this country in 1977, a single parent, 6 kids, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, during the height of the crack era. Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter, so my introduction to politics came at that point because we saw the community shift overnight. So going on from there, I was able to use as Stanley said, education as a tool, which was my mother with her 3rd grade education really instilled in us that we had to get an education in order to move forward. So with that said, I was reading an article this morning in the Atlantic, and I thought this quote would be fitting for us today, by Carrie Greenwich, which she talked about the book that's coming out about Malcolm X. And the quote, in essence, just sums up our existence as Black people, but also our lived experiences and our lived lives that help shape who we are. And are you guys able to see it? Okay, great. So, with the authors putting this book out, I thought this would be a great way to segue into this conversation. So as a communications and media scholar, I think the ideas and images that we put into our communities are ones that shape our lives. It allows people to interpret who we are. It allows us to express who we are. And I think it's about time that we start to use these resources at our disposal to control our own narratives, because these lived experiences help define who we are as we move forward. So from my background, I try to create in-language communication models in diverse communities. That means if I'm working with a group in the health sciences, for example, when I was at Penn, we had older women in certain communities that didn't want to take their diabetes medicine. And the issue was that the people in the literature, the people recommending that they do certain things and it look like them. So the idea of framing these communication tools and vehicles in a language or narrative that they can speak to was key. So forms of traditional media are always key, outdoor media, non-traditional media. So grassroots campaign, word of mouth is always key, particularly in elderly communities when you have opinion leaders and decision makers. So that means people in your religious community, coaches, teachers, people that impact you on a day-to-day basis. And if we're looking at younger generation folks, the social media is where they're at right now, emerging media, so forth and so on. So from a theoretical standpoint, we have 2-step communication processes where opinion leaders tend to dictate to the masses how they consume content and information. And those opinion leaders, as Dr. Perry mentioned and Dr. Andrisse, are the people we elect, right? So these are the people we look to govern our communities and our organizations. So for example, the district attorneys, the prosecutors, the sheriffs in these communities that we vote for or keep in office are the ones that dictate the policy and the messages that we get out, and the people in those communities react to them. The other one, which I'll talk about, which is media framing, which is really the key. I'm not a big, OJ's case and issues have different opinions from different people. But if I use this in my class and I say from a media framing standpoint, which is a persuasion theory in communications, if you look at these images, right, and you compare both of them, you have Newsweek and Time. The Newsweek article is the one that's the original picture. If you look at the Times article, theoretically, the image is dark. Well, the image is darkened. And then if you look at the image is already behind the text. So subliminally, you're already saying that he's already behind bars, just from a visual context standpoint. So when you look at the framing of some of these images, these are how messages get out into our communities, and these are how we interpret these messages, right? I'm going to show this video real quick, and I talked to my colleagues earlier about a man, Aaron, who was on his way to a job interview in a bus, saw a car turned over, caught on fire. He jumped out of the bus to go rescue the lady. This is ABC News, a national affiliate out of New York, and they led off the story with this headline: ex-convict misses job interview to save motorist's life. So if you see that, it takes away from what he's done to who he is, right? So they've already framed it. So I'm just going to show you a little clip from that excerpt from that and let you see what I'm talking about.
Man, hard on his luck, finally got a job interview, but risked it all to help someone else.
On a bus ride to the interview, he just happened to look out the window and saw an overturned car smoking. Right now, this is exclusive video you're looking at of the accident. Needless to say, he didn't make it to the job interview. Now the community is rallying around him. Here's Eyewitness News reporter Marcus Solis.
Surveillance video captures the moment of impact when a driver loses control and an unlikely hero emerges. This is Aaron Tucker, just a month out of prison. On Wednesday, he borrowed a dress shirt at the halfway house in Bridgeport where he's staying, boarded a bus for a job interview, and came upon the overturned car in Westport. In the video, you see Tucker run straight to the driver's window.
Like, listen, you're going to make it through this. Your family needs you. I need you. I personally said I need you because I really felt that way.
So what I noticed in this is a couple of things. You see the headlines: ex-convict, ex-prisoner. In the summary in the story, and I didn't show all of it, he's in a halfway house. So they're already framing his narrative about who he is. They're not looking at the other aspects of the story, which were played all the way to the end. He was on his way to a job interview. He had a son he was trying to set an example for, but none of that led the story. The story was about his past issues with the law and the criminal justice system, and how we perceive that. So that's one aspect of it. The lady who he saved started a GoFundMe campaign. And here's another visual context of it. Again, ex-prisoner misses job interview to save the motorist. The motorist starts a GoFundMe campaign, but look at the image, right? You see that image, a tank top, a guy in front of it. It doesn't say to me that you want to paint a different narrative for this person. What it says to me is I've captured you in one image, in one aspect of your life, and I want you to remain there. So when we talk about the visualization of telling these stories, all these things play an important part. So you have the lived experiences, you have the administrative and legal processes that we go through, the political aspects of it, but then you have the part that touches the community on a regular basis, because these are the people that impact some of these policy decisions. So today I would say I have a set of call to actions that we can discuss. Accountability and accuracy. For these media organizations that are in our communities, we have to be able to check them when something it's not right, right? We have to be able to call in it. We do it for Yelp reviews when we don't like a restaurant, right? We have a bad experience at a shopping store, we do that. But when it comes down to a story being inaccurate or something that you're not confident it represents the community as a whole, we have these two-way flows of communications. Before, the media would just put information out and we had to digest it. Now you have comment sections, you have emails. There are various ways you can do that. We have to start controlling our narratives and our own stories. We can't have people come in and tell us what we do, how we do it. We have to dictate who may be the best people to speak for us on our behalf, who can represent our message more accurately, and use these technological devices to become our own storyteller. If that's not more evident now during our current situation in the climate that we're in, with all the images caught on video of the mistreatment of Black people, I don't know what else is. The other thing would be to challenge the media structure in our communities to report accurate information. If we don't do that, we'll continue to have this misinformation. And then also, as leading advocates with these platforms available to us, we have to then message out. As I was talking to the panel early on in our other session, if I'm in Florida and I'm back into the community and I want access to the voting structure, how would I know that? How would I know where would I need to go to vote? What would I need to bring with me? If I'm even eligible to vote? All the things, the checklists that any ordinary citizen would have. But if I've been gone from that community for a while, I don't know what's going on. And from a statistic, specifically from Pew, Black and Asian, Latino communities, have access to more mobile technology and social media devices than most folks. We access it, we use it more than any other. So what I would say, we want to change the narrative from ex-con, ex-prisoner to Aaron Glover when it comes down to the portrayal of people in general. And I'll stop right there.
All right, so thank you, Dr. Perry, Dr. Andrisse, and Dr. Carruth. From the standpoint of someone who is beginning their work and scholarship on this topic, it was very insightful. to hear you all discuss the problems that you see, and then some possible solutions or some mechanisms for kind of making change in the way that the system is set up. I want to check and see if there are any questions from those who are in attendance. But before I do that, I would actually like to open it up to the panelists and ask if there was anything that your colleagues said that you wanted to kind of piggyback on or speak to, anything that you just want a moment to kind of unpack or respond to in support of your colleagues. Dr. Perry?
Yeah, I would just add quickly to what Dr. Carruth was saying from a communication standpoint. You know, all politics is mediated through what we watch on television nowadays in 2020. And so we know for a fact most voters are not reading lengthy news articles from the beginning to the end. We know that most Americans are not paying attention to podcasts and blogs, other than those that cross their news feeds and social media. And we know that that is dictated by an algorithm that we can't control. I don't know about you, I've got about 5,000 friends on Facebook, and I might see about 50 of them on my feed any given time. Where those other 4,950 people are, I don't know, and don't see them. Right, you know, and so I want to emphasize that because the language of ex-convict, I'm currently happen to be a student now in the Howard School of Divinity, and from a moral perspective, the language of framing someone's life based on what they did yesterday, or last week, or last year, all that from a framework of humanity, it's the wrong framework. We should be talking about today. Carpe diem, right? Seize the day. What are people doing now? Who are they now? How are they contributing today? Elections are always about the future. Elections are about what people want to happen tomorrow. And the more that we have this language in our media that refers to people's past lives, prior, I don't care if it was last night or it was last century, it doesn't make a difference, right? That what you did in your past, we should be considering, particularly as Black folks, I would say, who we know how we have been mischaracterized and misrepresented for centuries in media, in some cases in our own media circles, but that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But I think that the language that Dr. Carruth referenced about ex-convict, that's really ultimately right, is that all that people hear. You know, they don't even hear the rest of they don't read the rest of the video. Nothing else matters. And immediately that also is framed with race and color. So now Black men are ex-convicts. Now dark-skinned people are ex-convicts. Now, right, and they must be low income too because, right, he took a bus or whatever, right? All those associations happen with the simplicity of one word that frames the headline, the article. And when we live in a world where people are reading headlines and aren't reading the article itself, that is a huge problem.
Yeah, and if I could, piggyback off of that, Prison to Professionals works very, very, one of the framing ideas and values of the organization is changing the narrative. And once again, I left it in the chat for panelists, for attendees and panelists to visit our website. We have several video campaigns around changing the narrative and what it is to be someone who is formerly incarcerated or a person who has been through the criminal legal system. It's the narrative. And when we think about voting, just as, the communication piece is huge. As was just mentioned by my colleagues, that's how most people are not digesting large amounts of information around the candidates. It's these communications that are being sent to them. It's the narrative that's being told to them. And so really, in order to really start changing the policies that are disenfranchising us, that are causing the disparities and the many different things about the way Black people and communities can excel in this country and in life, is the narrative of what it is to be Black. And we need to change that. And, we need to be changing the narrative of, what we do at Prison to Professionals is really help to change the narrative of what it is to be a person who's been through the system. And, we've done, it's already been mentioned, but things like, convict, criminal, felon, ex-con. These are no place, there's no place for that in the movement right now. We need to be very cognizant of the language that we use. People with criminal convictions, formerly incarcerated people, currently incarcerated people. We've even shied away from using the word criminal justice system. What justice is there for Black people in the system? We prefer to use the word criminal legal system or punishment system. There's no justice in it for us, right? So we need to be cognizant of the words that we're using and the communications of how we're putting this forth. And it's the narratives that really will help us drive policy change.
Yeah, and if I hear Black on Black crime one more time, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And I keep hearing about it I hear about Black on Black crime, by the way, from Black people. It's not, you would think as a political scientist, I'm hearing about it in these conservative Republican circles, perhaps, or whatever. Yeah, they're talking about it that way as well. But it's also happening in a lot of Black circles. I've heard Black folks, Black men in barbershops where half the people there have had convictions from personal testimony that indicated that they themselves believed in this notion of Black on Black crime. And just to echo what Dr. Andrisse was saying, it's about the narrative, right? So it's not that necessarily we even believe that, it's that's the narrative that's been fed to us. And so it's easier for us to believe it.
Right, and if I could jump in here, it's a holistic process. It's multi-tiered. It's not one-dimensional. And I think we have to talk about narratives. We have to talk about ownership. We have to talk about all these things, these systematic structures that allow us to play in these different spaces, so to speak, based on our areas of expertise. So when you're talking about algorithm with Facebook and Instagram, we're more consumers. We're not dictating policy. We're not dictating organizational structure. We're not dictating how these things are messaged out. You make a mistake and say a word or type in a search engine for a pair of shoes and they're trolling you for the whole day, right? So how can we be a part of that conversation with our collective power to say, this is not accurate, this is not right? How can we do that? And I think it begins, as we've all talked about, in tiers of the companies that are involved in our utilization collectively of some of these media resources and outlets, and actually demand that we be a part of the process. And also there's representation within these organizations. And that's some of the things that I speak to my students about, being at the table to have these conversations. And then when you see I communicate from a communications perspective, the H&M ad, the Gucci ad with blackface, and there's a process before something goes from conception to before you see it on TV and a billboard. So along that line, there has to be somebody that either looks like you or somebody with some sense of understanding that we're we're in 2020, like that's not gonna work, right? So when it comes down to the way of messaging things out, as Dr. Andrisse said, we have to then use these same mediums to dictate the stories and the narratives that we want to tell. Yes, I've made a mistake or I have had some issues in the past. However, this is where my story picks up. We can have maybe a broader conversation about the historical context of things, but now I am doing this, right? And how do you push that, and how do you get collective buy-in to say these are the stories that we want to tell? And I think it really, to a certain degree, starts with us, the educational aspect of it, the awareness aspect of it, and the collective unity to say, if we don't change these narratives, we're going to fall into these kind of same cycles, which tend not to be in our favor over and over again. And rather than being the exception to some of these things, it becomes more of the norm.
Yeah, Dr. Carruth, I would just add that you made me just think of right now the concept that we have a situation where people are made to feel different because they've been locked in inhumane cages that most of us won't put our dogs in, and are in these situations. And by the way, thousands of these people in another form of a locked situation are right now in our southern border, who are only there because they're brown. Let's be clear, if they were Nordic, they wouldn't be there. And so, there's a clear culture in this country of wanting to put people in cages who are Black and brown. But this idea even that we have to like accept this altruism, this absolution, that they have to repent, that they have to apologize, that we have to, and this is where I think, I might be, leaning a little bit toward, Dr. Andrisse here, but in terms of like this notion of criminal justice, right? Well, why do they owe me anything? In other words, I guess what I'm saying is, why do they owe me an explanation, an apology about what they may or may not have done or did? I mean, no one's asking me what I've done or did in my life yesterday or whatever else. And I think I take this somewhat similarly, oddly, as a black gay person, that, the coming out experience, right? This week was coming out week again, and this is LGBTQ History Month here in October. Like, to me, like, I don't owe anybody my sexual orientation. I don't have to explain that to anyone. And I don't think perhaps a weird corollary, but I don't think someone who's been convicted of something owes anybody an explanation for what they've done in their prior life. And yet, right, we have this societal expectation that in fact is the case. And I think we need to erase ourselves from that expectation as well.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. Most certainly that, within our program, we really help individuals. So last year we had about 400 people apply to our program, and 100 or more complete our program. And part of what we do is, help people, give them training on how to tell their story. Because like you just mentioned, unfortunately, the society that we live in forces us to constantly tell our story. We're forced to. Like you said, you don't have to tell, you can choose to tell someone your sexual orientation. You can choose to tell someone if you're married or not, who you're married to. But as a person with a criminal conviction, we are forced to constantly tell people about it. And so, what we do until we get policies changed around that, we have to equip people with the ability to tell their stories in an impactful way. And that's again, to, harp on the idea of narratives. I wanted to just mention one other statistic that we've left out, is that Black women are the fastest growing population of people who are incarcerated. Thus, they are also the fastest growing population of people who are being disenfranchised from voting.
Over 1 million of them, yes.
A Black man, it's a very disheartening statistic, and it really hits me when I speak to high school kids and middle school kids in Black communities. I'm originally from the Ferguson, Missouri area, so I go and speak at high schools there, and in Baltimore, 1 in 3 Black men can expect to see themselves locked inside of a cage. And that's nearly 7 times higher than it is for a white individual, a white male. And for the female side of things, Black women are also nearly 7 times more likely than white women to find themselves locked in a cage. And they're, again, as I mentioned, the fastest growing population that is being disenfranchised, these collateral consequences are being placed against them. Another statistic that is very saddening that we need to get out and vote and change is that 48 states out of our 50 states, right? We all know we got 50 of them. 48 don't allow people, have some form of disenfranchisement, keeping people who've been through the system from voting, taking away their constitutional right. It's our right to vote. And yet it's on the books in 48 states that have taken it away from us, from mostly Black people. Let's not forget, it was designed to take away the vote from Black people, as my brother, my colleague mentioned earlier on the history behind it. The history behind it is after slavery ended, they said, how are we going to make sure these don't vote? Let's see, let's put this in the books here. If you have a conviction, you can't vote. You're actually not even really considered a person or a citizen. And on top of that, let's put extra laws to make sure that we find ways to lock them in cages more. Like it's so serious, man. It's really serious, and we're being attacked, and it's almost we don't see it. It's they've designed it in a way that it's hard for us to see. There's 20 states that take away, even if you're not locked in a cage, 20 states will take away your right to vote if you're on probation or parole, and 11 states will take your right to vote even after you've gotten out of prison or jail, you're off of probation and parole, yet they still don't consider you a citizen. Like my home state of Missouri, a very middle belt country or state with really ruled by conservative thoughts, and they take it away for nearly someone's life, pretty much.
Yeah, I'm from Ohio originally, so I'm quite familiar with the Midwest and the kind of moderate conservatism that governs most of its politics. I will say this, because I know you mentioned, Dr. Andrisse, the notion of kind of they, right? They do this, and I wanted, as a halfway political theorist here, to just for us to unpack this notion of us versus them, and from the standpoint of democracy participation. When we refer to they, we're referring to people who have power. And the people who have power for a variety of ways, a variety of reasons. Some of it's structural, some of it's racist, some et cetera. But some of it's also because they've exercised the power. And I certainly want to encourage all of us here to not just participate in the continuation of the bifurcation of this kind of black and white dichotomy in American society, that somehow it's the man, it's them over there that's holding us down. That is there. Voter suppression is real. All those things are legit. That needs to be at the forefront of our minds and our actions. Yet also, I'm a both and guy, we need to also be asking ourselves, what have we done? Who did we bring to the polls last week? Do you even know who you voted for 4 years ago? Do you even remember who was on that school board ballot? Who was on that zoning board ballot? What issue did you support? And when you actually ask Black communities these questions, because that's of course where my heart and my love, biasly resides, and that's the member of my own community. Sometimes, at least for me, you get attacked because, right, there's this notion that, well, why should we be even complicit in being an instrument of our own oppression? And I am so sensitive to that argument. And yet we are stuck in a situation called a two-party system that can only change. But by the way, it can change. So if you don't like the Electoral College, if you don't like that the 13th Amendment says, accepting the punishment of a crime, that, there are ways to change that. And the way to change it, you got to change the amendment to the Constitution. In order to do that, you need a majority of state legislatures and a majority of the Congress to support it. And that means it's going to require us to know who our state legislature members are. And that means that we need to be paying attention in local elections.
And if I could jump in real quick, I'm gonna put my my legal hat on. So I went to John Marshall Law School in Atlanta. I was the president of BALSA, the Black Law Students Association, and just being a part of that organization, piggybacking off of what Dr. Perry said, you got to participate. You have to be involved in these different tiers, because each of these tiers provides you with a certain amount of information, a certain amount of access. So as a president of the Black Law Student Association, I was connected to the Gate City Bar Association in Atlanta, Georgia, which represented, the civil rights workers and movers and shakers in Atlanta during various times during the movement. But when you get to connect with those people, you actually can see where you can fit yourself in the process. So that's one part of it. And then also locally, as Dr. Perry mentioned, moving to Washington, D.C., I always feel guilty and try to make sure my family and I are engaged in the civic processes in the communities which we are part of. I feel like, what the community is giving us, we need to give back. So I just can't sit down and just accept the fact that, the schools are getting better and not be a part of the process. As my wife and I, we brought our kids up in public school. We became active in the PTA. She was the president, I did the bylaws. We went to middle school, we were actively involved in that process, because those are the tiers that you get information. Those are the tiers that put you in connection with your city council person, who's over, educational reform, access, all these things. I moved on to high school and became at-large member, vice president, and president of the PTA at my son's school. But all this to say, there's different ways to participate, to become engaged. In the community standpoint, I sat on the ABL committee in the A Street corridor where we're governing what types of businesses come into the community, what type of businesses remain in the community based on certain policies and guidelines that businesses adhere to do in order to maintain their licenses and be able to sell alcohol and do these other things. And slowly, as the community shifts, so do the businesses. So you see the makeup shift, right? So that means that we are not part of the economic process of making sure our community maintains a certain level of diversity and engagement. So we again, echoing what Dr. Perry said, we have to stop looking at they or them and versus we. What are we doing? Where are you actively participating? I remember in my Stratcom class 2 years ago about the debate about, people walking on campus and having their, dogs use the bathroom on college campus. And I'm saying, okay, you guys either you live on campus, you moved into the community, you're around Howard in some form or fashion. Do you know when the ANC meeting is? Do you know what policies and regulations are in place from a very basic community engagement level that you can actually enact change? So, part of it, going back to the communications piece now, is about awareness, which should ignite some form of participation. Where do you see yourself in that process? What are you passionate about? And where do you want to contribute to the ongoing conversation? Because they're all intertwined at some point in some way. And if you get involved at some level of comfort based on scheduling, resources, whatever it is, you're helping shift that dynamic. You're helping shift culture in some of these spaces where ordinarily we don't belong, or technically they say we don't belong, and where we don't participate because we don't really know about it. If, the recent conversation about critical race theory in the literature that, the Trump administration decided to take out of these government offices because they deemed it anti-white. So we go back to the old conversation of affirmative action. If I could walk in here and just showcase my talent without being judged on anything else besides then we don't need those programs. So obviously these things are in place because historically there have been barriers for participation. And at the end of the day, if we're not part of that and we walk in, these policies don't exist no more, we pretty much are starting over. So, it puts us we're always seem to be on defense, never on offense, right? And that becomes a challenge for us. But I think where we are now, the climate of the country, having panels like this and creating communities of scholars, intellects, and folks who are engaged in the process in whichever way they can, we need to keep this momentum up because it's only going to help us, within our specific circles. And I'll stop right there.
I want to get to some questions of the audience, but I have one other comment you made me think of, Dr. Carruth. And when you mentioned critical race theory, I used to be president of the Association for Ethnic Studies. And one thing, my parents are from the silent generation. My daddy's 87, sociologist, criminologist, and I think he might be listening to this actually right now, and a founder of Black and Ethnic Studies back in the day, one of the original members of Association of Black Sociologists, et cetera. I mentioned all that because, back in their day, there were a thing called freedom schools, right? That we created in our own communities because we understood that public education was not giving us the education that we needed to wrap ourselves around with in our own neighborhoods and communities. We've stepped away from that. And I certainly would encourage that we need to revisit that as a community, where we ensure that we get the education that we need so that by the time they arrive in our classrooms at the college level, right, that students are aware of Black history, of this, criminalization of women and other minorities, and that these aren't like facts that they're learning about for the first time. I don't know about you, I've been a college professor for a while, and at a variety of different institutions around the country. I've been blessed to have that opportunity, and people do not know what they should. And that is a reflection on public education. And I think Black communities, Black neighborhoods have an obligation, Black community organizations, you mentioned ANC, et cetera. We gotta be teaching ourselves about ourselves, particularly when we know that folks are not getting that from other sources.
Okay, thank you all. So I do want to take this opportunity and see if we have any questions from the attendees. So if you all have some questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. Something that I would like in the interim while we're waiting for people's questions, something that I would like you all to maybe address and contextualize a little bit further. We have talked a little bit about it, but just to kind of add on to it, what the enfranchisement of returning citizens means actually in this current moment, right? And so if we recognize that Judge Amy Coney Barrett is now heading to the Supreme Court, which is pretty much on path for that, and that her understanding of the vote is that the vote belongs to the virtuous, right? And that if you have exhibited some level of unvirtuosity in your lifetime, then it makes sense that you wouldn't be able to vote, and that she is not willing to fight or even contest the issues around felony disenfranchisement about the vote, but she doesn't mind that people are able to maintain their gun rights. And so thinking about that as part of the current political climate that we're in, thinking about the fact that the protest, right, is now being prosecuted, right? That people are being given felony convictions for protesting things that are they're finding egregious in terms of treatments of Black and brown bodies. And so if you all can talk a little bit more about why the enfranchisement of returning citizens is especially important in this current moment, I think that would kind of expand the conversation for us.
If I could just, reiterate something that I didn't expand too much on, and then, hopefully my colleagues could come in and add to it. The 2000 elections told us a lot about, our modern disenfranchisement as it, being one of the more recent elections where a debacle took place in terms of voting. And that took place in the state of Florida, right under our eyes. Like, there's this thing that took place that was clearly targeted at a certain group of people. We have somebody who's going to be president or, running to be president, and his brother was running the state that this happened in. And, I mentioned earlier that Florida at that time was the state that had the most stringent felony disenfranchisement laws. It was, predicted that nearly half of Black people would not be able to vote if those laws had stayed the same for about 15 to 20 more years, which is actually like right now. And that, some laws actually just, there were some laws that changed in Florida. But going back to that 2000 election, the recount took place because there was, part of that problem was that there was a large amount of people with convictions that went to the polls unknowingly that their rights had been taken away from them. And they said, nope, you're not a citizen. Like, what are you doing here to vote? And, a good portion of primarily Black votes were taken away because of this law. These disenfranchisement laws were targeted, again, I've said it a couple of times, were targeted and made to be targeted at Black people. And so what it means is that, we are being attacked at trying to get to that power. And, very, agreeable, this us versus they thing that, was just mentioned. But, there's power that is trying to keep Black people from accessing those resources and power. And, for me, that's they. There is a entity that is trying to keep me and people that look like me away from accessing resources and power.
Yeah, and I would agree. If you look back at that election, it was like I think it was a foreshadowing of what we see now. If you really think about it, and that was 20 years ago, right? Right. So if you think about where you were mentally and, figuring out the system would work, because that's just how it's designed. It's never been challenged. But then when you start to retroactively look at connecting the dots, and I think our current political climate even exemplifies that more, just based off of, if the outcome of the last election had been different in Florida in the gubernatorial race, right? We would then be talking about different types of laws that would be more proactive in favor of what we're talking about here. simply because of the executive body that would be in place, and also some of the local congressional offices that would have a say in that, because people tend to kind of get galvanized when things occur that they may see themselves being a part of, right? So now that that's not the case, you know, you have to question, is the level of excitement, the level of engagement the same? Would these folks that are now in power and, you know, really trying to kind of systematically keep the structure that they have in place, would they cede power? You know, would they give it up because they know the majority of the people that they're trying to suppress are the people who don't ideally see things the way they see it, right? They have different lived experiences, and those different lived experiences help inform who you are. You become more aware. You figure if you've been burnt once, you're going to learn from that and figure out to do something different. And if that doesn't benefit you, why would you change that structure? Because then you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. And I think we see that more evident now. And I think as challenging these situations are, it kind of pulled a veil back on some things that probably have been going on for a very long time that we just maybe took for granted, or just assume people were going to take the moral high ground and just say, you know, this is what we're supposed to do. But we're not seeing that. And I think the importance of us getting more involved and coming out of that election, I think I talked to my students about the organization Color of Change and what they're doing in terms of understanding that, you know, it's been said, I think Tip O'Neill said that all politics is local, right? So when you have issues that impact your community and you empower somebody to represent you, they truly have your interest in mind, or they're not going to be in that position anymore. And the more and more we become engaged and aware of these activities and our role in that, I think we'll start to see a swing of the pendulum. But it can't be just for this election. It has to be something that we ingrain in who we are, like civic engagement. You know, if we don't like the things in our community, we have to actively be a vocal presence in that process, whether we are, even if we're not running for office, we are participating in the process. And as going back to the article that I mentioned earlier, some parts of the article talked about people being poll workers, as you mentioned, the 98-year-old women that helped you out, Dr. Andrisse, and her role. So where do you see yourself in the process, especially if you want things to change, and how do you plan to continue being a part of that process and that engagement, and encourage the people in your household and in your circle to continue?
I would only add that I think, to the question of, you know, Amy Coney Barrett and Electoral College and this notion of virtuosity in voting. Again, from a moral perspective, you know, I think we become very problematic as a society when we begin to associate some type of a morality clause when it comes to a constitutional right. And I personally would be concerned for Amy Coney Barrett at St. Peter's Gates with that type of a philosophy. But, you know, that's another conversation for another day. I would say that I think these two gentlemen stars on with me are gunning for an affiliation appointment in political science and arguing for civic engagement so eloquently. I will throw out a book for folks, and I will emphasize this is by a white guy, but, you know, some white guys are doing some great work on these issues. A guy named Jim Morone, Morone. This is not directly related to felony and disenfranchisement, but he's written a book called Hellfire Nation. And it's a great American race and history story about the politics of sin in America and how that has changed all of our relations as it relates to race and engagement and the civic capacity. And I think what I would like to leave us with to focus on going forward is what it is that we can in fact do. Because I think that it's important for us to acknowledge that when we talk about any institutions of government and power, we're talking about ourselves. You know, the documents really do actually say we the people, right? And it's a legitimate concept. And so, for example, when people feel as though the Electoral College, you know, pulled wool over their eyes. What that says to me as an educator is that you didn't learn about the Electoral College before you voted. So it's not, so it was a surprise to you because you were ignorant. Ignorance to me is not a bad thing. It's not a pejorative. It's not a negative label. I'm ignorant about most things. Don't ask me anything about chemistry. I can't help you. But when it comes to these kinds of issues of not being informed, and again, in our public education, let's be clear, that's the one place that we all have to do. Right, we all have to go through public education. What you do after that is kind of up to you. But in America, you got to at least touch in high school a little bit, in order for you to be able to move on. And we don't require that students have civics anymore. And this has to be something that begins in Black communities where we are demanding state boards of education, and we're demanding local city councils and other orgs in our communities to actually paint the picture about why we should all be participating, even in circumstances where it seems as though it's against our own beliefs. And I'll shut up with this. I hope people please vote and participate, and that you vote your interests, not your beliefs. Because when we vote our interests as Black people, we win.
And I know we are short on time, but just to kind of echo off of that, the interest is for me, a safe environment for my family. I like my garbage picked up. I like these kind of basic quality of life things, right? So when you look at people who are running for office, who stepped out there, because politics is not, it's not a spectator sport. You have to go in there and be ready to battle. But who's going to represent you? What is of importance to you? And all of it, again, goes back to where you are in your life trajectory, right? If you're, past a stage where your kids are out of the house, you may be more interested in things that may be impacting the elderly in your community, and that's where you may find your sweet spot. If you have kids you have young children, you may be in the education space. If we're talking about people who are part of the criminal legal system, that may be the pot that you're in. But all of it is about engagement. And I think, as you mentioned, Dr. Perry, awareness and where you participate in the process. Coming home and sitting down and saying, they said this and they said that, is not an option for me. I always ask, my kids and my family, who's they? Who's this mysterious they? Can you describe them? Can you define them? Because they seem to have so much power in terms of what we do that, I feel helpless at times. So how do we actually participate in the process, and where do you see yourself in that trajectory of growth?
So Dr. Andrisse, Dr. Carruth, and Dr. Perry, I want to thank you for your time and your knowledge today. You've given us a great amount of insight into what is a very pervasive political issue at this moment. But more than that, you've given us some action plans in terms of thinking ahead as to what can be done, and some optimism that things can change in the future if we are determined and intentional about our activities. So thank you all. Definitely appreciate your time with us today. And with that, we'll call it an end, everyone. Thank you for participating. Thank you for joining us. And you all take care and have a great weekend.
God bless you. Take care.
Bye.